Hello, family. Welcome back to the Explore the Extraordinary podcast. My name is Betty, and today I'm joined by Doug. And Doug has a PhD in quantum computing and is also an author. And I'm really excited for your willingness to serve our community at IANDS, Doug. I don't want to waste any time. I'm going to toss it right over to you. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, Betty. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk with your team today, your gang, your friends. So a lot of people call me QuantumDoug because I do everything quantum. I believe that the mind is really a quantum mind, and even the brain is quantum-esque, but it's really not even a quantum computer. It's more like an antenna. And the reason I say that is because we know that people like your audience are having NDEs, but they're also having other kinds of transcendental experiences, right? And so like out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences and precognition. And most of those transcendent experiences, I call them transcendent experiences because they really don't fit in any classical worldview of science. And so most scientists say, well, those phenomena don't exist at all because science can't support them. And I'm here to tell you that science can support them. You just have to use a different class of science. And it's more akin to quantum computing than it is any kind of classical computing, okay? So what I do is I'm working on a thing called source science, and that there's a common source for the mind as well as quantum physics. And it's all, and I call it source science as a general label, and it's beyond classical computing and classical physics. It also includes quantum computing, and it includes things like quantum mind ideas and transpersonal experiences. So I've been working on this stuff for a really long time. And, I hosted a workshop on physics and computing back in 1992 and another one in 1994 because I was interested, how do I get the science in all of this, right? And so by hosting those two conferences, workshops on physics and computing, we ended up getting involved in quantum computing. And then starting a couple years later, I started a PhD in quantum computing and got a PhD in 2002 in quantum computing. So basically I have the math and science background to support what we know about quantum computing, but in a different way, in the sense that I didn't like the math that they used for quantum computing. So my specialty now is the quantum math, but I use a particular approach to it as geometric algebra math. And so this is important because it says, look, the science is there, but just like quantum computing, you can't do quantum computing without the math. Well, you can't do really source science without some ideas of the math. So there's this hyperdimensional system out there, and it has particular properties that I assume has to be there, and it's based on bits. So I call it bit physics. So I have a little slide here to sort of make the point about what I'm going to tell you about that. So I'm going to show the screen here, and I'm going to bring up this slide here. And this is a favorite slide of mine to produce. It says basically bits form the quantum substrate, okay? And so there's this cartoon about Dilbert. He says, I created this simulated world made entirely of software, which is information. And I programmed all the people in the simulation to think they're real people with free will. And of course, the little dog bird says, are they sentient beings? And he says, they think so. What if they discover their true nature? And Dilbert says, I programmed limits into their physics so they can never observe the walls of their reality. For example, they can't get to the edge of the universe because they can't exceed the speed of light. And they can't find out what they are made of because to them, it looks like probability at a quantum level. And the dogbird says, wouldn't those limits tip off the smart ones? He says, I coded them not to trust smart people. And so this is funny at so many levels because you can't simulate a world and all the people in it in software that you can sit on your desktop. Because the simulation of just even humans, like we know from AI, and the simulation of the entire universe is so big, it would require a computer bigger than the universe to include all of that. And that's what I call source science. And And it's interesting because even Richard Feynman was tiptoeing around this idea in a strong way. He said, nature isn't classical, damn it. And if you really want to make a simulation of nature, you'd better make it a quantum mechanical one. And by golly, it's a wonderful problem because it doesn't look so easy. Okay. And so I think that's interesting because if you're going to have a simulation of the universe and it includes the simulation of quantum physics, then that you can't do what he's saying. You can't have a computer that's sitting on your desktop simulating the universe. So people say, oh, the simulation hypothesis, and I'm going to be doing more and more talks on simulation hypothesis. And the idea is there a simulation infrastructure that I would call source science that whatever its properties, in fact, I'm giving a talk in August about this. So let's talk about what that physics might look like. I call it bit physics, okay? And the reason I say that is it's like the movie The Matrix, right? Another movie that's modern right now that's going on is the three-body problem. They have this virtual reality system in there with a pair of virtual reality goggles that are so real that you bend down to pick up the dirt and you swear you can feel it, okay? So what is that substrate, okay? And so I'm going to go right, here's a quick, I'm just showing you a particular thing. Most people think everything above the blue line way down here at the bottom. And that's all what I would call the Planck scale, okay? So when you're talking about most of physics, they're all talking about above this line. What I'm talking about is below this time. I call it the hyperspace, bit physics, protophysics. And this is the domain of quantum, the quantum states. Quantum states are more mathematical than they are physics. And yet quantum computing can be done using that mathematics, okay? So, so if you look at, I'm going to switch over and skip past this one here, and I'm going to say, well, there's a whole bunch of ideas about what dimensionality is. But what we're going to do here is we're going to go to look at I'm going to go to the one that I want to look at here. Hang on a second. Yeah, this is the one I was looking for here. So if you have bits as your only thing, this is the basis of my dissertation back 20 years ago. And basically there's a mathematics for bits. And this is slightly different than the math that they use like in Shannon entropy and those kinds of ideas. And why is this important? Because if you're going to have a structure that's beyond space and time and beyond matter and energy, just for source science concepts that are transcendent, that supports transcendent experiences, you have to have sort of an informational infrastructure to support that, like you would a virtual reality system, okay? So this is my description of what that is. And this was guided to me, you can think of it as my journey, is figuring out what this was. And this happened, over 20 years ago. And so here's that idea, is that you can have bits represented in a mathematical form that looks like this. It's a vector. And so what you have is a bit that can be plus state or minus state. It's like plus and minus, plus 1 and 0, 1 and 0 bits, okay? And we have them as a vector either pointing up or down, okay? This is like math of physics, okay? And these are bit vectors. I call them bit vectors. But if you take two of these, you then have one orthogonal to the other one, okay? And since they're vectors, they're not just sitting there on the table. They're actually its own two dimensions. And they're each its own bit. And they call them bit vectors. And what's interesting is if as soon as you have two vectors like this, and you're combining them into a same state space, you now have this thing called a bit vector, and you have a bivector. A bivector is a constructed item that's the plane constructed of these two planes here, and it has an orientation in and out of this space. So this here is a sort of a computational molecule that's a two-dimensional thing. Regular quantum computing doesn't really have this thing. The closest they have to this is the imaginary number I, and this is equivalent to that. And so now you have quantum computing can be defined by these three states, and that's what I did 20 years ago, is show that you can completely show quantum computing using this, okay? And then, but yeah, we can also show other things, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But then if you have three of these dimensions, it turns out, it looks like this. And that's the beginning of the math of three-dimensional spaces, which mathematically you can talk about quaternions if anybody is a technical person. But guess what? That's the basis for all of photons and all of those standard model arguments, models, okay? And finally, the last one here is this one here is an E-bit, entangled bit. If you take 2 qubits here over on the second column and you combine them, you get what's called entangled bits, okay? What's interesting is this is a space-like thing, and this is a concept that's important to know. If anytime we're talking about non-locality, it means non-locality from the perspective of 3 dimensions. Well, every E-bit is 4 dimensions. So if it's 4 dimensions, and every E-bit has its own private 4 dimensions, then there's a millions and gazillions of dimensions in the world mathematically like this. And it's required there to support things like Shor's algorithm and other things like that. So this is an entangled space, and it has space-like properties. So once you realize, oh, there's a bit infrastructure that has simulation-like properties, and you can simulate 3 dimensions in even 4 and 5 dimensions, now you have an infrastructure that says, look, I can simulate a 3-dimensional world inside a 4-dimensional and a 5-dimensional universe, okay? Just talk about what all this means. That was just sort of like the introduction, you know. It says you have to have some kind of hyperdimensional space. And that hyperdimensional space is the basis for all of quantum computing, including non-localness of E-bits, okay? So now if all of a sudden you have non-local behavior in transcendent experience, there's a mechanism in the simulation layer to support that. You don't have to invent anything new, or you don't have to use funny words like spooky action at a distance, which is what Einstein did. He was trying to make fun of it by calling it that. Unfortunately, fortunately, I guess, Einstein was wrong. Spooky action at a distance, it actually works. It does its thing. And so mind is really inside of a hyperspace. There is a hyperspace system that allows you to have a hyperspace phenomena, okay? And there is a mathematical infrastructure to support that. And so now it's like the Matrix. It's like a virtual reality system, and you have objects that can be simulated in there. You can have structure in there. They are mathematical. They're not physical objects. It's all math. It's all computer science. It's all in the simulation environment. And that's the basis of your mind. So why is that important? And why was it the physics related to this an important part of the story that I'm telling you? Well, the reason is people who've been doing the double slit experiments, where they've tried to have people actually influence the double slit experiment. These are Dean Radin's experiments. He produced a device that was essentially a self-running double slit experiment. And he showed that when people put their attention on that, then you can influence the quantum state. Well, there's nothing that should be able to influence a quantum state unless it's another quantum state, okay? And the fact that the mind can do that is an important construct in the sense that the mind is part of the same infrastructure as quantum mechanics, the fact that it can interact with quantum mechanics, okay, in the double slit experiment. So that's really important, because now you can say, well, the mind therefore can influence physical reality. Well, if the brain has a similar mechanism due to neurons, or the gap in the neurons where the neurotransmitters are, or the microtubules, that there's some kind of quantum properties there, the mind can influence those quantum properties too. So it gives you a mechanism for mind control interacting with the brain, and now the brain is viewed as an antenna, okay? So what does that mean? Well, it means that the mind is really separate from the brain. It doesn't emerge from the brain, because these quantum states are independent of the physical brain, okay? These quantum states are outside of time. So now you can start dealing with not only simulation hypothesis, but now you can explain other NDE-related phenomena, or lucid dreaming phenomena, or remote viewing phenomena, as literally your mind can access the information states in other places in the world, because it can access non-local information. I mean, it's built on an infrastructure that's non-local, okay? And it gives you some interpretive power over what's happening when they have a near-death experience, okay? So let's talk about that. If your mind is really separate from your brain, and there is an infrastructure to support a mind separate from brain, because we have this informational hyperdimensional infrastructure, just that's bit oriented, bit physics oriented. And it does simulation of 3 and 4 dimensional spaces inside there. So now you can have virtual worlds that are running inside there. And that's the basis for lucid dreaming. But when you have a near-death experience, what happens is you're decoupling the mind from the brain traumatically, unfortunately. And so now all of a sudden, they're not paying attention to the brain like you would in a lucid dream. Okay. And now you can access that virtual reality environment. And it's real in the sense that it's not hallucinatory any more than a lucid dream is hallucinatory, or out-of-body experience is hallucinatory. It's actually happening to you because there's a mechanism, because the mind is separate from the brain. Okay. And this is important to realize it's actually happening. So people who have near-death experiences have a trouble time integrating that kind of experience back with their regular worldview. They can take solace in the sense that it's okay, it really happened to them, and they just have to stop resisting that and just start saying accepting that, because it's real and there's science to support all of that. Okay. And I know I'm going over it at a very high level, but I'm saying that so that you realize that, I've talked about all these ideas in my book, Deep Reality, and this was co-authored by William Tiller, who's a famous scientist in this area. And unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago. So, you can read more about that there, and also on QuantumDoug.com. You can see all the talks I've given. But I wanted to say couple more things about this experience of a near-death experience. What does that mean? Okay, so what do they usually have? They all of a sudden they're outside of their body. They still have awareness. Why is that? Because the mind's eye exists independent of whether the brain is there or not. And so that's our attention point. Okay, and we can focus that wherever we want to. And that's what we do when we're doing out-of-body experiences and lucid dreams, right? And so as soon as you break away from your body temporarily, doing an NDE, now all of a sudden people say they have this tunnel experience, okay? And they have a life review. Well, what is that tunnel? What is that life review? Well, since the mind is no longer in time, in space, the mind is not in time and space, it exists in this hyperspace, then all of a sudden you're in the realm that we would call the spiritual mind. And there is no time in that domain, really. So you've stepped out of time. I call that phenomena panoramic time. It's like you can see all of time as like you're looking over the Grand Canyon, you're looking at the entire Grand Canyon from a bird's eye view. Well, you're looking at your whole time history from a bird's eye view outside of time. And you're still used to thinking about sequential time. So you think of it as a life review, but it's actually happening all at once, right? So even the life review can be defined as an outside of time phenomenon. And time, many people talk about outside of time phenomena. And an example is neurolinguistic programming mechanisms talk about Hawaiian timeline therapy, okay? And so that's a common way of exploring your past, but a lot of people don't realize that the only reason that works is because your mind is outside of time normally anyhow. Your real subconscious and superconscious mind, your higher self, is outside of time anyhow. And in fact, it's outside of time for you and all your previous lives. Think of it as a puppeteer with strings attached to all of your lives simultaneously. So you can do timeline therapy to look at previous lives too. And that's a common phenomena to do that with timeline therapy. So when you step out of time, you have this life review, okay? Well, what do people describe as a life review? They basically say, well, they're experiencing all their phenomena, all the things that they interacted with all these people in their entire life, right? But they're experiencing it not only from their perspective, but from the other person's perspective. Well, that is a sort of more like a telepathy kind of mechanism. And they're like looking at the entire state of that interaction and everybody's mind and emotional state at that time, all of that simultaneously. So that's like a mind's eye view of that entire environment. Well, There's nothing energetic about that. That's all informational oriented and telepathic oriented. Okay. So even it says even emotions are part of this telepathic state. Emotions aren't chemical and they're not neurological. So one of the biggest things that people have is they have this life review, they have all these emotions, and then they meet loved ones or whatever, and they meet spiritual beings over there. They said that the love is beyond description. It's so much. Well, when I tell people, look, if emotion and feelings were chemical or neurological or biological, they would all saturate. You couldn't have more than a certain amount, right? But the fact that in the mind's eye, those emotions are actually meaning, and you can have more and more of that meaning, and there is no limit to the meaning you can have for love, okay, and awareness. And so you have to have a model for how you can have meaning to support that phenomenon. And that's part of the bit physics, is this meaning. Okay, so what is meaning? So Robert Monroe was a guy who was a pioneer in this area, and he basically was an out-of-body experienced person, a very good one, and he wrote many books on the subject. And he basically said when they were doing essentially remote viewing experiments, he says people would do a remote viewing, they would ask for information about this location, right? And all of a sudden, this piece of information would come, and he called it a rote, R-O-T-E. And it's basically what he calls his terminology. He was an engineer, he liked to name things. And he called it a packet of meaning. So how can you have a packet of meaning when you don't have matter, energy, space, or time? What is the encoding? What is that encoding? Okay. And it's a little topological meaning module. It's a little structure in the mind, in this hyperspace, that has meaning. And that meaning molecule shows up in many esoteric traditions, okay? And I'm just using a modern label for it, but it's basically, some people call it a download, right? It's a little packet of meaning comes in, and telepathy works that way. So that structure of meaning molecule, okay, is actually has this structure that I showed earlier, these little topological pieces to it. If you start out with that quantum is randomness ultimately, okay, that's the normal way people view the world, okay? But you can have this randomness is ordered, and you can make order out of it, okay? And so these are these rotes, essentially. Quantum computing, you can do this with quantum computing. And this wasn't actually the slide I was looking for, but it has the same ideas in it. And one of the things that I'm doing now, as follow on from my work of my book and dissertation, is working with some of the people that I got introduced to through Dr. Tiller. And we're actually building technology that helps us build ordered states like this. So we're kind of doing quantum computing in the open. We don't need a quantum computer down at minus 450 degrees Fahrenheit in a super cooled room in order to do quantum computing states. We can do them in the open space using technology like this, okay? So I just wanted to introduce you to that idea that it's possible to start thinking about this stuff in a way that we didn't know about before, because we have a different view of quantum computing, okay? Even entanglement itself, people say entanglement is really fragile. Well, I gave a talk already 10 years ago that says, no, entanglement is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And because it turns out that even space itself, you can think of as an entangled aspect of itself, okay? And so there's a whole bunch of mathematics associated with that, and I've given talks about that. And so entanglement is everywhere, which means everything is four-dimensional above, including dark matter, dark energy, quantum computing, E-bits, they're all entangled, okay? Even space itself is entangled, okay? So entanglement is everywhere, okay? And in order for it to be entangled, it has to be at least four-dimension, and it has to have structure to it. So the conventional quantum computing does a disservice because it just sees everything as a bunch of dimensions, but doesn't talk about the structure in the dimensions. I'm going to go.
Yeah, I'm gonna come in with some questions if that's okay. Yeah, I really,
Yeah. And
I
so,
love, go ahead.
yeah, so, really the main points I want to talk about is you have to talk about this in the construct of people who are trying to understand this are trying to understand. So what does this mean with the way how the universe is constructed, right? So that's what I'm trying to do. And including that is how space and time are constructed. So if you have this model that there's a hyperdimensional space, and that hyperdimensional space has its own new kind of time to it too, then you realize it's outside of time, it's panoramic time, and you can support all this phenomena that we have with the life reviews. You're separating from your brain, and you can talk to others, informational beings out there, whether they be deceased family members or spirit guides or however you want it. It could be, whatever. And but the reason why we know this has to exist because there's this thing called shared death experiences, right? And so I could talk some more about that if you want, but essentially, shared death experiences where somebody's sitting there watching a near-death experience and they get swept up in it too, and they're not even having any kind of trauma. Okay, so that's kind of like
Well,
an important
actually,
subject to talk about.
yeah, I think some of the questions that I have are more kind of focused on your particular journey, if you're willing to share that with the
Yeah,
audience
yeah. So
about if there's any kind of phenomenon that has happened to you individually that kind
yeah,
of, yeah, really solidifies these theories
yeah,
for you.
yeah, exactly. Well, I've always been an engineer, but I've always been interested in metaphysics ideas since I was in college back in the 70s. Okay. And so I say, if any of the metaphysics is true, then there must be a kind of, I was already into computers back in college and high school, since 67, before computers were really well known. And I said, well, there must be information science associated with this. So that's been my life journey. Okay. And so I've met all these amazing people. And one of them was the dean of engineering at Princeton, who said, metaphysics is an important scientific subject. He wrote a paper in the IEEE journals about it back in the early 80s. So I went to the Monroe Institute back in the 90s, and I had a transcendent experience, several transcendent experiences there. Met Bob Monroe. He's my hero too, another hero. And I had a transcendent experience where I was at the Monroe Institute for a week, and I started talking with four-leaf clovers, and they were talking back, and they're saying, "Hi, here I am," And I had several occasions that week where they were doing that with me, and so I knew that transcendent experiences were real because I was experiencing them, right? I mean, I haven't had an NDA, but I've had the chain of transcendent experiences like that. Another one was I was in a deep meditation at a Monroe Institute, and all of a sudden I started getting my higher self, sort of like a being was coming in saying, giving me a life lesson on what the structure of physics of space-time was. And it was all tetrahedral based, and showing me what this was. So, and I've also met people where the first time I met them, we were telepathically reading each other's thoughts simultaneously. We both knew this. Okay. And so telepathy is very real for me because I've experienced it. And I know many people, sets of people who telepathy is part of their life. And, either individually or collectively, they interact with telepathy all the time. So I'm always trying to define these experiences that I've experienced that other people's experience, these transcendent experiences, and give them a scientific basis for them so people can say, yes, this happened to me, rather than denying that or being, bullied by people who say it can't exist, right? So that should be helping people to say, yes, this happened to me, and I just have to want to live with that, and it's a better thing. Essentially, we're more advanced beings because we've had these experiences.
Yeah, I think that there's so many people in our community who have had these experiences. And I think for me, particularly, it's so useful to be able to quantify it in some sort of science so that I don't think that I'm losing my mind just because it's not part of our regular collective conversation. I'm kind of curious about your upbringing. If you were exposed to this kind of stuff as a kid, like, were you exposed to any sort of faith, or did all your thoughts transform? If you're willing to share that part of yourself with us.
I've always had an engineering mind, but I was, quote, raised Catholic. I mean, my parents were Catholic, right? and I was an altar boy and a choir boy and went to church parochial school. And so, but I had one thing that most Catholics don't have, is I have no guilt. So I was like, I don't have karma built into my life. I don't know where that comes from. And so I wasn't held back by that kind of thinking. You know what I'm saying? And so in some respects, I've had sort of a charmed life. It's like, I know what my path is and it's going to unfold. And I haven't really had a dark night of the soul either, because I really don't have this guilt or karmic aspects of it to recover from. So, was my childhood perfect? No, but it wasn't traumatic to me in the sense that I've always been pretty smart. And so I learned all these things, and I was curious about all these things too. So I hope that answered your question and then all these other transcendent experience happened to me. So I knew they were real. It was the intellectual side and the experiential side combining together to form this life path that kept unfolding,
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering if you have any sort of theory around why some people have these experiences and some people don't.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's some people who are naturally, from when they were little, they were already had a loose connection with their brain and mind, they talk to their invisible friends since they were little, and so those people naturally had sort of the looser connection there. And you could call it a gift, you could call it a looser connection, however you want to do it. I just that they were ahead of their time. I would like to have sometimes a looser connection there, because I would like to do more lucid dreaming. I even went to a lucid dreaming class last year at the Monroe Institute for a week, So I want to be able to do that better, because I think lucid dreaming is a gateway to higher consciousness, and a lot of other people say that too. And they say anybody can learn lucid dreaming. We all lucid dream because our mind is separate from our brain. And so we can just have to tap into the memories of that. When we come back into this reality, we have to bring some of those memories back and get used to tying the connection between those two. So did that answer your question? Hopefully.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that I come across a lot of people who they experience feelings of jealousy towards spiritual experiencers or near-death experiencers. My response is usually like, I'll kill you if you want me to. But I think that it's important to kind of talk about what are some tangible tools to kind of loosen up those cords. I think that that's really interesting, so that people can be more in the flow of experiencing sort of these supernatural experiences.
Well, I tend to hang around with people who are exceptional people, the weirdos, and some of my best friends are all remote viewers. I have several really good friends. Some of them I met at the Monroe Institute. And a lot of them are telepaths and healers. And I find those people the most interesting because they're living their authentic life. And a lot of those people are naturally, they've been that way their whole life. Okay. But I also see that once somebody's had a near-death experience, then all of a sudden their switch is switched, right? And so then they can't go back to their old life. And so it's like they're almost starting over. And so really they have to accept. So they shouldn't be jealous. People shouldn't be jealous of that. They have to figure out for themselves, without having a near-death experience, what is the technique that they can get to release and tap into their higher self, right? Because your higher self is a quantum mind that's so big it doesn't fit in our brain, and it's smarter than we are, and we need to tap into that. And you could call it your spirit guides. A lot of people just don't believe in their spirit guides. They don't know that they can ask for help. Law of attraction style of help. There's another book called Higher the Heavens, where you can ask for spirit guides to help you, And so there's all these techniques, meditation techniques, silent retreats for meditation. I mean, I'm not encouraging people, but a lot of people are doing ayahuasca, those kinds of things too. They're trying to loosen that bound. And historically, shamans did that. Their shamanistic traditions were the shamans would have these experiences because they would be using, natural elements in their environment to loosen up that connection and have that sort of spiritual experience, So each person has to find their own way, whether that's bowls, tuning bowls, or meditation, or float tanks, or Monroe Institute, or meditation retreats, whatever. You just have to decide what works for you, and don't have a near-death experience on purpose, please.
I totally agree. I agree with that.
And then there's the people who have serial NDEs, where their health is fragile, and they have half a dozen near-death experiences, and my heart goes out to them, because their life is kind of chaotic, because they keep having those, and they're trying to integrate what that means. So, well, how do you integrate NDEs?
Yeah, well, I think the big thing to remember also is that we're here to have a human experience. So while it's really cool to conceptualize all these much larger things, we left that much larger thing to come have this very small experience.
Yeah, heaven on earth.
Yes, let's have that experience on earth. Let's connect with each other. For me, like, one of the greatest tools for integration and having that feeling of unconditional love is connecting consciously with another person, like we're doing right now, or connecting with community. We have a great community at IANDS, just shameless plug for IANDS. But I really enjoyed connecting with you today and hearing all of this amazing knowledge. And if you're watching this in real time, Doug is going to be doing an extended version of this presentation on July 20th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So there'll be a link in the liner notes of this episode to check that out as well. But I just want to see if there's anything else that you want to share to feel more complete about our time together today as we wrap up.
I mean, I'm planning on going to the IONS conference in Phoenix at the end of August, and for that conference. And I'm just drawn to these people with these transformative experience, and coming to reality, coming to grip with this is the new you. And I think anybody who's ever have a transformative experience, they've changed. And the question is, can their old way of living doesn't hold them back from going into the new way? And if there's anything that I can do to support that with, say, it's real, the science is there to support it, just figure it out for yourself, figure out your path, then I'm doing a service to the community. So
thank you so much, Doug. Really looking forward to hearing your extended presentation and seeing you at the conference this year. And thank you again for your service to our podcast. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.